When Captain Vanessa Carter boarded her flight home, the last thing she expected was to have her rightful seat in first class questioned. A man refused to believe she belonged there. But what she did next didn't just silence him, it changed lives. This is a story of courage, compassion, and a response that no one saw coming. Before we start this touching story, tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and if you enjoy stories like this, be sure to subscribe for more inspiring narratives. Let's begin. Captain Vanessa Carter held her boarding pass firmly, her weary eyes scanning the chaotic airport terminal. After 6 long months in Afghanistan, she was finally heading home. The weight of her deployment hung heavy on her, but the thought of reuniting with her family after months of video calls and letters brought a faint smile to her lips. Now boarding first class for Flight 6112 to Colorado Springs, a voice announced over the intercom. Vanessa blinked, momentarily confused. First class? She glanced down at her ticket, and sure enough, it read first class, seat 3A. She'd flown economy countless times, but never in this kind of luxury. It must have been an upgrade, a rare moment of good fortune she didn't question. Pulling her backpack higher on her shoulder, Vanessa made her way toward the gate. The echo of her military boots on the jet bridge was a rhythmic reminder of the road she'd traveled to this moment. As Vanessa stepped onto the plane, the scent of recycled air hit her. She scanned the gleaming first-class cabin, taking in the cushioned seats and polished finishes. The stark contrast between this and the cramped, rattling military transports she'd grown accustomed to was almost overwhelming. "Welcome aboard, ma'am," said a flight attendant with a professional but warm smile. "Your seat is just over there." Vanessa nodded politely, placing her bag in the overhead compartment and settling into her spacious seat. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to relax. She stretched her legs, marveling at the extra space, and closed her eyes, letting the low hum of boarding passengers fade into the background. But her peace was short-lived. "Excuse me," a sharp voice broke through. Vanessa opened her eyes to see a well-dressed man in his 50s standing in the aisle, his face a mix of confusion and irritation. His gaze swept over her uniform, lingering on the captain insignia stitched into her sleeve. "I think you're in my seat," he said curtly, his tone tinged with disbelief. Vanessa kept her composure. "I'm sorry, sir, but this is my assigned seat." She gestured to her boarding pass, which sat neatly on her tray table. The man frowned deeply, leaning closer to inspect the ticket. "There must be some mistake. This is first class." His tone emphasized the words, as though Vanessa couldn't possibly belong there. Vanessa felt her stomach tighten, a knot of familiar unease forming. She'd encountered this kind of bias before. "I assure you there's no mistake," Vanessa replied evenly, picking up her ticket to show him. Before the man could argue further, a flight attendant appeared, her professional smile unwavering but her eyes sharp. "Is there an issue here?" "Yes," the man snapped. "This woman claims this is her seat, but I paid for first class. There's clearly been an error." The flight attendant glanced at Vanessa's boarding pass, then back at the man. "Sir, Captain Carter is indeed assigned to seat 3A. There's no error." The man's face flushed, his voice rising. "I paid good money for my seat, and I won't have." "Sir," the flight attendant interjected firmly, her polite tone hardening. "I'll have to ask you to lower your voice. Captain Carter has every right to sit here. Please find your assigned seat so we can prepare for takeoff." The man hesitated, his mouth opening and closing as though searching for a retort, but eventually he huffed and stormed off. Vanessa exhaled slowly, the knot in her stomach tightening. She could feel the stares of other passengers, some curious, others sympathetic, but she kept her eyes fixed forward. "I'm so sorry about that, Captain," the flight attendant said softly. "Can I get you anything before we take off?" Vanessa shook her head. "No, thank you. I'm fine." As the plane taxied down the runway, Vanessa gazed out the window, her thoughts replaying the confrontation. She had faced far greater challenges in Afghanistan, yet somehow moments like this left a deeper sting. As the plane ascended, the rumble of the engines became a steady hum, blending with the faint murmur of voices in the cabin. Vanessa let out a slow, measured breath, the tension from the earlier confrontation still lingering in her chest. She had faced life-threatening missions in Afghanistan, yet the sting of being questioned, of having her place and identity doubted, was something else entirely. Her gaze drifted to the window, where the sprawling city below was quickly replaced by a blanket of clouds. The sight reminded her of the view from her base overseas, those rare moments when she'd look up at the same sky, yearning for the comfort of home. But even home, it seemed, wasn't immune to moments like this. Vanessa shook her head, determined to focus her mind elsewhere. Reaching into her bag, she pulled out her small, weathered notebook, a trusted companion throughout her deployment. The pages were filled with everything from tactical notes to personal reflections, moments of clarity scrawled in the dead of night. Flipping to a blank page, she began to write. "Dear Sir," she started, her pen hesitating as she thought carefully about her next words. This wasn't going to be a letter of anger or retaliation. Vanessa wanted to use this moment, this uncomfortable encounter, as a chance to communicate. She wanted to share a glimpse of her story, the sacrifices she and countless others like her had made to serve, and perhaps challenge his assumptions in the process. As her pen moved across the page, memories began to surface. She wrote about her first deployment, how she had felt both terrified and resolute stepping onto foreign soil for the first time. She wrote about the bonds she had forged with her unit, a group of individuals from all walks of life who had become her family. There was Luis, who had a knack for telling the worst jokes at the best times, Monica, whose courage had saved Vanessa's life during an ambush, and Ahmed, the interpreter, who had risked everything to help them navigate the complexities of their mission. These memories brought a bittersweet smile to her face. The faces of her comrades were etched into her mind, each one a reminder of the strength and humanity they had shared in the most trying circumstances. The plane jolted suddenly, pulling Vanessa from her thoughts. Gasps rippled through the cabin as turbulence rocked the aircraft. The seatbelt sign flickered on, and the captain's voice came over the intercom, assuring passengers that it was nothing out of the ordinary. Vanessa remained calm. Her military training had prepared her for situations far more precarious than this. But as she glanced around, she noticed an elderly woman across the aisle clutching her armrests tightly, her knuckles white. The woman's breathing was shallow, and fear was etched into her features. "It's all right, ma'am," Vanessa said gently, leaning slightly toward her. "Turbulence like this is completely normal. Just take slow, deep breaths. It'll pass soon." The woman looked at her, her eyes wide but softening as she took in Vanessa's reassuring tone. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice trembling. Vanessa nodded with a calm, steady smile. "Absolutely. I've been on plenty of flights like this. It's nothing to worry about." The woman took a shaky breath, her grip on the armrests loosening slightly. "Thank you, dear," she murmured. Vanessa continued to offer quiet reassurances until the turbulence subsided and the plane steadied. Around her, other passengers who had been visibly uneasy began to relax as well. It was a small moment, but it reminded Vanessa of why she had joined the military in the first place: to protect, to reassure, to be a source of calm amidst chaos. As she settled back into her seat, Vanessa became aware of someone watching her. She turned her head slightly and saw the man from earlier, the one who had doubted her place in first class. His expression had softened, his earlier indignation replaced by something she couldn't quite place. Regret? Curiosity? Vanessa offered him a small, polite nod before returning to her notebook. She added a line to the letter, one that reflected her thoughts in that moment. Sometimes, the uniform we wear tells only part of the story. The rest lies in the sacrifices we make and the moments that shape us, moments that can't always be seen or understood at first glance. As the plane began its descent into Colorado Springs, Vanessa folded the letter and placed it in an envelope provided by the flight attendant. She glanced at it briefly, considering whether to hand it to the man. After a moment of hesitation, she decided to follow through. When the plane landed and passengers began gathering their belongings, Vanessa stood and approached the man, who was retrieving his carry-on from the overhead compartment. He looked up, startled, as she extended the envelope toward him. "Excuse me, sir," she began, her voice steady but kind. "I wanted to give you this." The man frowned slightly, his eyes flicking to the envelope. "What is it?" he asked, his tone cautious. "It's a letter," Vanessa explained. "I thought it might help clear up a few things. You don't have to read it now, but I hope you'll take the time." The man hesitated, his gaze shifting from Vanessa's face to the envelope and back again. Finally, he reached out and took it, his fingers brushing the edge of the paper. "Thank you," he said quietly, his tone subdued. As Vanessa turned to leave, she heard him clear his throat. "Captain Carter," he called after her. She paused, glancing back. I think I owe you an apology," he said, his voice low but sincere. "I made assumptions earlier that I shouldn't have. I'm sorry." Vanessa nodded, appreciating the effort it took for him to admit his mistake. "Thank you," she replied simply. The man hesitated again before speaking. "My son served in Afghanistan," he said, his voice tinged with emotion. "He didn't make it back." Vanessa's heart tightened. She placed a hand over her chest, a gesture of respect. "I'm deeply sorry for your loss, sir. Your son's service and sacrifice are honored." The man's eyes glistened briefly before he looked away, his emotions clearly threatening to overwhelm him. "Thank you," he murmured. As they exited the plane and parted ways, Vanessa felt a mix of emotions: sadness for the man's loss, but also hope that her letter might offer him a different perspective. Vanessa stepped off the plane and into the bustling terminal, her heart pounding with a mix of emotions. She scanned the crowd for her family, her mind replaying the events of the flight, the confrontation, the letter, the man's apology, and the shared moment of grief over his son. It was all swirling in her head, but she pushed it aside when she spotted them. Standing near the baggage claim, her parents and younger brother Max were holding a large handmade sign that read, "Welcome home, Vanessa." The edges were decorated with small American flags and stars, a touch that immediately brought a smile to her face. "Vanessa!" her mom cried, rushing forward with open arms. Her dad and Max followed closely behind, their faces glowing with pride. Vanessa barely had time to set down her bag before her mom wrapped her in a tight hug. "Oh, sweetheart, we've missed you so much," her mom said, her voice thick with emotion. "I missed you too," Vanessa replied, blinking back tears. She hadn't realized just how much she needed this embrace, this moment of normalcy. Her dad stepped in next, pulling her into a bear hug. "We're so proud of you, Vanessa. You've done us all proud." Max, ever the jokester, waited his turn before grinning and pulling her into a one-armed hug. "Glad you made it back, sis," he teased. "The house has been way too quiet without you bossing everyone around." Vanessa laughed, the sound light and genuine. "I'll be sure to make up for lost time." As they gathered her belongings and walked toward the car, Vanessa felt a sense of peace settle over her. The terminal was chaotic, but for the first time in months, she felt like she could finally exhale. The weight of her deployment, the uncertainty, and the confrontation on the plane all seemed to fade, at least for now. The Carter family home was a modest but warm two-story house nestled in a quiet neighborhood. As the car pulled into the driveway, Vanessa noticed the extra touches her family had added for her homecoming. A banner stretched across the porch, more flags lining the walkway, and balloons tied to the mailbox. The sight filled her with gratitude and love. "We kept your room just how you left it," her mom said as they carried her bags inside. "Though I might have dusted a little," Vanessa chuckled. "Thanks, Mom. I'm sure it's perfect." After dropping her things in her room, Vanessa joined her family in the dining room, where a feast awaited her. The table was covered with all her favorites: her mom's famous pot roast, mashed potatoes, green beans, and warm rolls fresh from the oven. "You've been eating out of tin cans for 6 months, her dad joked as he handed her a plate. "We figured you could use a proper meal." The evening was filled with laughter and stories. Vanessa shared bits and pieces of her time overseas, careful to leave out the more harrowing details. She didn't want to burden her family with the full weight of what she had experienced, at least not yet. Instead, she focused on the moments of camaraderie with her unit, the small victories, and the hope they had clung to in the most difficult times. As the night wore on, her mom's perceptive gaze lingered on her. "Vanessa," she said gently, "you've seemed a little distracted since we picked you up. Is everything okay?" Vanessa hesitated, her thoughts drifting back to the flight. She hadn't planned on bringing it up, but something about the safety of home made her feel ready to share. "Something happened on the plane," she admitted. "It wasn't anything bad exactly, just unexpected." Her family listened closely as she recounted the encounter with the man in first class. She told them about the confrontation, his assumptions, and her decision to write the letter. She spoke of his apology and the revelation that he had lost his son in Afghanistan. Her dad's face grew somber. That must have been hard, for both of you. It was, Vanessa agreed. But in the end, it felt like maybe something good came out of it. I don't know if my letter will change how he sees the world, but I think it at least made him think. Her mom reached across the table and placed a hand over Vanessa's. You've always had a way of making people see things differently. Even when you were little, you were the one standing up for others, finding common ground. Max chimed in with a grin. Yeah, like the time you made me stop picking on the neighbor's kid and forced me to invite him to our treehouse. Vanessa laughed, shaking her head. I'd forgotten about that. Her dad leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. You know, Vanessa, the things you've done in the military, the leadership, the courage, the compassion, you can bring all of that back here. There are people in this community who need someone like you. Vanessa nodded, though she wasn't sure what that would look like yet. She had come home searching for peace and clarity, but now she felt the stirrings of something bigger, a purpose that extended beyond her own journey. The next day, Vanessa was sitting on the back porch with a cup of coffee, enjoying the crisp morning air, when her phone buzzed. She picked it up and saw a text from an unknown number. Captain Carter, this is Mark, the man from the flight. I read your letter again last night, and I wanted to thank you. Your words really struck a chord with me. If you're open to it, I'd like to meet and talk. There's something I'd like to share with you. Vanessa stared at the message, her mind racing. She hadn't expected to hear from him again, let alone receive such a heartfelt response. After a moment, she typed a reply. Hi, Mark. I'm glad the letter resonated with you. I'd be open to meeting. Let me know when and where. They arranged to meet later that week at a small cafe downtown. Vanessa arrived early, her curiosity piqued. When Mark walked in, she could see the tension in his shoulders, the weight of unspoken words hanging around him. Thank you for agreeing to meet me, he said as they sat down. Over the next hour, Mark opened up in a way Vanessa hadn't anticipated. He told her about his son, Alex, a proud Army sergeant who had been killed in Afghanistan 2 years earlier. The grief had consumed him, turning into bitterness and anger that he hadn't known how to process. Seeing Vanessa in uniform on the plane had brought all of it rushing to the surface. I judged you unfairly, Mark admitted, his voice heavy with regret. But your letter, it made me realize how wrong I was. It reminded me of the kind of person Alex would have wanted me to be. Vanessa listened intently, her empathy evident. She shared her own experiences, the lessons she had learned about resilience and understanding, and how moments of connection, no matter how brief, could change lives. By the time they parted ways, Mark looked lighter, as though a burden had been lifted. Before he left, he mentioned a veteran support group he had started in Alex's honor. We help vets transition back into civilian life, he explained. I think your story could inspire a lot of people. If you're interested, we'd love to have you join us. Vanessa promised to think about it, her heart warmed by the unexpected connection. Vanessa couldn't stop thinking about her conversation with Mark. His story, his grief, and his transformation after reading her letter had sparked something within her, a sense of purpose that she hadn't felt since returning home. Over the next few days, she reached out to Mark to learn more about the veteran support group he'd mentioned. When Mark invited her to attend their next meeting, she agreed. The meeting was held in a modest community center on the outskirts of town. As Vanessa walked through the doors, she was greeted by a diverse group of men and women, each with their own stories etched into their faces. Some had been out of the military for decades, while others were still adjusting to civilian life after recent deployments. Mark stood at the front of the room, addressing the group with a mixture of authority and warmth. He introduced Vanessa to the attendees, sharing how they had met and the impact her letter had on him. She reminded me, Mark said, his voice thick with emotion, that we all have stories worth telling, stories that can help bridge the gap between those who serve and those who don't understand what that really means. Vanessa felt a surge of humility and determination as the room filled with applause. When it was her turn to speak, she shared her journey, her reasons for joining the military, the challenges she faced overseas, and the lessons she learned about strength, unity, and compassion. By the time she finished, the group was visibly moved. Some nodded in understanding, while others wiped away tears. One woman, a retired Navy officer named Clara, approached Vanessa afterward. "Thank you for sharing your story," Clara said, her voice trembling. "It's been years since I left the service, but hearing you speak, it reminded me that we're never really alone in this." Vanessa smiled, her resolve strengthening. "That's why I'm here," she replied, "to remind all of us and everyone else that our stories matter." As the weeks went by, Vanessa became an integral part of the veteran support group. She worked alongside Mark to expand their outreach, organizing workshops and panel discussions that brought veterans and civilians together. The goal was simple but powerful: to foster understanding, to build bridges between two worlds that often felt disconnected. One of their first events was held at a local high school. Vanessa stood in front of a room full of teenagers, their faces a mix of curiosity and skepticism. She began by sharing her experiences in Afghanistan, not the sanitized version, but the raw truth. She talked about the camaraderie that kept her going, the moments of fear she had to push through, and the sacrifices that weren't always visible. But she didn't stop there. She encouraged the students to think beyond the headlines, to see soldiers not just as warriors, but as human beings with hopes, fears, and dreams. One student raised his hand. "What's the hardest thing about coming home?" Vanessa paused, the question hitting her harder than she expected. "Honestly," she said, "it's feeling like the world moved on without you, like the person you were before doesn't quite fit into the person you've become. But that's why I'm here, to bridge that gap for myself and for others." By the end of the talk, the room was filled with applause. Several students approached her afterward, thanking her for opening their eyes to a perspective they hadn't considered. Word of Vanessa's work began to spread. Soon, she was being invited to speak at community events, local government meetings, and even regional conferences on diversity and inclusion. At every event, she carried the same notebook she had written in on the plane, a symbol of the journey that had brought her to this moment. Mark became a trusted partner and friend, his once gruff demeanor softened by the bond they shared. Together, they brainstormed ways to reach more people. Mark often reflected on his son, Alex, and how proud he would have been of the work they were doing. He believed in bringing people together, Mark said one afternoon as they prepared for another event. "I like to think we're honoring his memory by doing this." Vanessa nodded, her heart full. "We are, Mark. And we're helping others see that they're not alone, no matter what they've been through." One bright Saturday afternoon, Vanessa found herself standing behind a podium at the very community center where she had first joined the support group. The room was packed. Veterans, students, community leaders, and families filled the chairs, their faces a mixture of anticipation and curiosity. Vanessa scanned the crowd, spotting familiar faces. Her parents and Max sat near the front, their pride evident. Mark was beside them, nodding in encouragement. Clara and other members of the support group were scattered throughout the audience, their presence a reminder of the bonds she had formed along the way. Taking a deep breath, Vanessa began, "Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Vanessa Carter, and I'm here to talk about bridges, not the kind that span rivers or highways, but the kind that connect people. The kind that remind us of our shared humanity, even when it feels like we're worlds apart." She spoke of her time in the military, the lessons she learned about resilience, and the encounters that had shaped her. She told them about the man on the plane, how a moment of misunderstanding had turned into an opportunity for connection. "When I wrote that letter," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion, "I wasn't sure if it would make a difference. But it did. It reminded me that even in moments of conflict, there's room for understanding. And that's what this is all about. Finding that space where we can listen, learn, and grow together." The room was silent, every face focused intently on her. Then, as she concluded, the audience erupted in applause. That evening, as Vanessa sat on her back porch, the applause from the speech still echoing in her mind, she felt a deep sense of fulfillment. What had started as an uncomfortable encounter on a plane had transformed into a mission, one that gave her purpose beyond the battlefield. Her phone buzzed with a text from Mark. "You were incredible today. Alex would have been proud." Vanessa smiled, her heart full. She typed a quick reply. Thank you, Mark. We're just getting started. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Vanessa looked out at the quiet neighborhood that had always been her anchor. She thought of the bridges she had built between herself and Mark, between veterans and civilians, and between her past and her future. The road ahead was still uncertain, but one thing was clear: she had found her purpose, and she was ready to keep building, one connection at a time. Thank you so much for watching and being part of this journey through Captain Vanessa Carter's story. Her experiences showed us how empathy and courage can transform even the most difficult encounters into moments of connection and growth. What part of Vanessa's journey resonated with you the most? Have you ever faced a moment where understanding someone else's perspective changed your view or theirs? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your stories and insights are what make this community so meaningful. If this story moved or inspired you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that challenge, uplift, and bring us closer together. Thank you for your time, and we'll see you next time. Until then, remember, every interaction is an opportunity to build a bridge. Take care.